Hello, everyone. Tonight we're continuing on our series on the bicycle illustration, and we can see this illustration. It's got the back wheel, uh, which is the classic navigator wheel illustration, with Jesus at the center, feeding into the empowered disciple in action, with loving people, believers in the world, and loving God through our times in the Bible and prayer. And then we have the front wheel, which is the guiding wheel, which the alongside helps guide the process of making disciples. And again, Jesus is the center, but the spokes are very different here. And here it's how we go about making disciples through relationships and intentionality, and then where we're going in terms of the big picture, generations, and kingdom. And what strikes immediately is that Christ is the center of both. And so, what's the point of having this second talk on Jesus being the center of ministry? And what I found is that there is actually a subtle difference here, and we really need to take it seriously. And so what we're looking at is, where do I see the key responsibility for ministry? And I realized this issue some time ago when I was in student ministry in Southampton. And I started talking with students about what made them tick, what they were living for. And it soon became apparent that the core of where people were going was basically, it was about themselves. Now, they were well educated, well brought up people, so they were being about themselves in a very nice way, but then it was still, they were the center. And then what horrified me was to realize that I was just the same. I was doing my ministry from myself at the center. So I was trying to maneuver people into the kingdom. I was coming up with plans and strategies about how to get people into the kingdom of heaven, and even how to manipulate people into righteousness. And this was not appropriate. In fact, the Lord challenged me and said, this is actually wickedness. And so this whole thing of the self being the center is very deep, and it comes from our culture. We live in a world that is worldly. And so we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 3, and it opens with, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly. Now, we think of worldly as people who follow a whole lot of lists of do's and don'ts. 40 years ago or so, it would have been going to the cinema and smoking and drinking and all this kind of stuff, and that would class you as worldly. But what someone has recently just pointed this out to me, that actually our worldliness in today's world is about our attitude that it's the self is the center. And that's got a very different feel about it. And I see this, and I've noticed this for many years. If I was to tell someone that someone has had some success in ministry, the response would be, oh, what did they do? It's all about the person or the technique or the program that they were following. What they don't say is, wow, what an amazing God. How did he help this person? How did he develop them along the path that they would end up becoming the person who would produce this kind of ministry? Or another way of looking at it would be, when someone is coming up with a plan, then others who disagree with them might say, if you do these things, then these terrible things will happen to your ministry. If you fail to recruit people into a student ministry, then in 3 years you will have no student ministry. These terrible things. Or there are people who've got these great plans for your life and great plans for your ministry. You'll say, if you do this program, then you will see growth. And in all of this, we forget the grace and the power of God. We forget that actually Jesus is sovereign. Moving on to verses 3 and 4. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? And in Paul's Corinth, there was a competition over who you should follow. It was all about who was the key leader. But in our day, we take a slightly different light. It's more about what strategy are you using for church growth? Or, from a navigator perspective, how are you trying to do disciple making? What's your strategy for disciple making? And there are a whole load of different areas of spirituality which people emphasize. But in the end, the focus is down to a form of ministry that people have developed. Now, I'm not saying God wasn't involved in those. What I'm saying is that when we are presented with this plethora of programs and we make the pick of which ones we're going to use for building up the church. And so the focus is on me as the leader for making my pick. And what I'd like to suggest is that we actually approach the whole area of ministry with a sense of humility before Jesus. What does he want me to do? Who is he in this process? So we go to verses 6 and 7. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. And Paul was willing to see God as the architect of ministry. It was God who made things grow. So we live in a world where people are wanting to exalt their program. This program has produced these results, rather than God has produced these results. What is God doing? Are we willing to step back before deciding on where we need to go in ministry and actually spend the time to ask him, what do you think, Lord? What's your plan? How do I fit in with what you want to do? It's been hitting on me in new ways, this verse, Isaiah 42:16. I will lead the blind by ways they have not known. Along unfamiliar paths I will guide them. I will turn the darkness into light before them and make the rough places smooth. These are the things I will do. I will not forsake them. Am I willing to stretch out my hand and say, I don't know, God? I've got lots of ideas. I've got lots of plans. I could come up with a plan tomorrow, no problem. But actually, I want to offer you my hand as a blind person and ask you to lead me into what you think is actually the best thing to do. And wait and trust on him. Then we go to 1 Corinthians 3:9. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. And Paul saw that he was not the answer. This is all about God. It's about what he's doing. And because it's about him, and because it's what he's doing, he is the marshal of the resources. And one of the characteristics of all these great plans that we hear about and get encouraged to take on board is that we don't usually have the resources for them. But because Jesus is the one who brings us into what he wants us to do, then he is the one who's responsible to provide the resources for what's needed. Now, he might lead us into a path which brings those resources about. That's great. But we don't have to carry that burden ourselves. So when we arrived here in Brandon about 4 years ago, we got involved with our local church, and it's quite a small church, and it soon became apparent that there was those inner core of people who are busy, and were too busy. And so when the church was looking around for people to do new things, they realized they didn't really have the people who they could ask, because all the people they could trust were over capacity. So then we turned up, so we were available to some degree. And an alpha course, felt like we needed to do another alpha course. And people were hinting about, well, would Eva and I be willing to do it? And so I saw, well, there's an opportunity here, because at the same time as this was happening, in another stream in our cell group, I saw this couple who I knew the church wouldn't trust. They weren't quite polished enough for the church to trust with ministry. But I said to the church, would you let me work with them for a year? And then at the end of the year, they will lead the Alpha course and I'll sit in with them. So I'm coaching them through that process. And they said, great. And in fact, that couple have just finished leading the Alpha, and they're now doing a post-Alpha course. We're using the Navigator's First Encounters booklet for that. And they've done great. And they have grown enormously through this process. And so God has brought us together. And I've just been one part of it. If you stepped back in that group, you would think, well, what on earth is Derek doing here? I mean, it's all Paul and it's this couple, and they are running this ministry. And it's been beautiful to watch. So then we move on to verse 10. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. And Paul was a wise builder, but he wasn't perfect. He was a human being, just like you or I. And he made mistakes. And he had blind spots. So there would be areas of that foundation which was supposed to be Jesus Christ complete, but there would be bits that he would completely miss out. And there are bits that we will completely miss out. But God knows that. He knew Paul, and he knew the people he was going to, and he knew where there would be strengths and where there would be weaknesses. And God, thankfully, as the master architect, is able to bring in other people who can cover for the weaknesses we've left. Because none of us is Jesus Christ. He is the master builder. And he brings into play people who will cover for our failings as builders. So when we were in our previous town in Loughborough, we were kind of kept a bit at arm's distance from ministry because the vicar there had a rather bad experience with the Navigators. He was a bit reticent about us. But there was this other couple, Deli and Ibe from Nigeria, And there were no such hesitations about him. He didn't have an organizational name to kind of cause red flags, but he did know relational discipleship. He'd come through a group led by a guy called Gabriel in Nigeria. And so the two of us kind of used to meet together. And he could do the practical stuff in the church that I couldn't do. And I could help him develop in some of the strengths that the navigators have. They have incredible strengths about focus on Jesus and the word. And then we have a few more tricks in terms of how you go about the process of developing disciples. And together it produced something beautiful, or I hope so. So there are ways in which God works because he is the chief architect. He takes the load that we don't have to. And we can entrust this ministry to him because it's his, and we can rely on him to handle the fact that we have deficiencies. So to summarize, 2 questions for us. These aren't the group questions, but 2 questions. Am I willing to stand before Jesus as a blind man, blind person, and allow him to direct the ministry? Am I willing to humble myself and say, I don't know? Or rather, I think I do know, but Lord, I'm willing to just humble myself and let you show me what you think rather than grab the reins myself. And then the second one, can I relax? Some people don't like that word relax, but can I go with Jesus? He is yoked together with me. Can he take the load? Can I allow him to take the load? And especially in the area of resources. If the ministry is his, I can wait on him to provide the resources to lead his ministry. Then we've got some questions here. So that's questions for discussion on this talk. And then finally, a book on this idea of worldliness. So that nugget came from Andrew Fellow's book, Smuggling Jesus Back into the Church, which I would love to recommend to you. So that's the end, and I pray that this will be a blessing for you. Amen.